Well, I was going to say good morning, ladies and gentlemen, but of course it's not. It's well until the afternoon. But here we are. I'm up to number 9, so we make progress. Now, and I get that over there. Now, you may notice that, or may think that I'm in more somber garb today. It just so happens that it's a bit cooler, and this is the best variation on the shirt that I can find for this morning or this afternoon. But it has nothing to do with the fact that my subject today is the cemetery. So this is, if there's a link between the somber garb and the cemetery, it's entirely accidental. When I was young, there wasn't much to do down our end of town. We were the only school kids there. There was my cousin, my brother, my sister, and a few other families there in the street near the golf links. I think they might call that Carter Street, but we really had to stick pretty well together, just my cousin, my sister, my brother and I, and make our own entertainment because there was no TV, the radio wasn't worth listening to, and so we just wandered. And I think so long as we were home for tea, everything was okay. Well, where were we to wander? Well, we could have headed down towards the 2 Mile, but that seemed to be rather too adventurous. And in any case, there was nothing much of any great interest down there. The real interest in our area was over the gully, and we'd go down past the golf links and the golf house and over that little gully crossing that used to be there. And there were 3 places there that were of interest. One of them, of course, was the cemetery. The other one was the sewage treatment works. And the third one was what we call the Sand Hill, which meant it was the place of retirement for a lot of old down-at-heel pensioners. And so, well, we used to sort of have a look at the sewage treatment works and used to think that riding around on that circular spray that they had might have been exciting enough, but we never tried it, out of squeamishness, I think. But I think we'd also would have had to climb the fence. They might have had a bit of barbed wire at the top or something. So we didn't spend much time there. We used to go down to the pensioners' huts, of course, from time to time. We found some chooks once in a yard beside old Mrs. Creevy, Mrs. Hasted's place, and they laid quite a lot of eggs, and so we used to collect them, and we'd go and sell them, 2 bob a dozen or something like that. And but we got to know some of the old pensioners. There was an old fellow called Billy O'Keefe over there who used to make whips. He'd plait leather whips for us or make nulla-nullas. I don't know whether he ever essayed the boomerang, but certainly he would provide some mulga nulla-nullas. And the whips though were very good. Well, and the nulla-nullas were very good also. But the main place of entertainment, of course, was the cemetery. May have seemed it wasn't exactly Disneyland or anything like that, but it was the best thing that was going. And it had a number of challenges. It had, well, I mean, there were gravestones and so on, but gravestones would tell stories, and quite a number of them actually told a story. And so it was interesting to go and have a look and just see what stories could be found on those gravestones. And then, there was a certain exotic flavour about them because right at the back of the cemetery in those days were the Chinese graves. In those days, I think there were about, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe more, but half a dozen, plus Chinese graves, identical in form. So we would wander, and there was also a sort of numerical challenge because each grave was numbered. And in the very early days, I used to organise hunts for my brother and my cousin and maybe my sister also. Who could find the lowest number? And over we'd go, and we'd have half an hour to find the lowest number. Who could find grave number 1? That type of thing. Well, we never did find grave number 1. Now, I claimed on one occasion, or in my memory I claimed anyway, that I'd found number 4. But whether that was true or not, I really do not know. It sounds unlikely to me, but, if I'd been asked to swear to it, I probably would have. But it was, the cemetery, of course, has expanded in size in recent years. I don't know when that was, last 10 years, 15 years, whatever it may have been. But before then, in my youth, it just had one standard size. And in the southwest corner, quite low land there, a little higher than the gully itself, but still pretty low. Well, have a look. Yes, the southwest corner. Along the fence that used to be there were a number of, I recall, graves of very early single-digit numbers. Now that seems unlikely when I look back on it now, because I can't even find when the first burials were made there. I've searched for, when the cemetery area was gazetted. I dare say if I rang someone I could find it, but I can't find it through Trove and so on. But anyway, the cemetery had, enormous interest in the numbers, in the stories, in the grave decorations, and in the sort of slightly spiritual quality of the place. My mother used to say, look, there are rules. You mustn't walk over people's graves. That's very rude, and it brings bad luck. I'm not quite sure who the luck appended to, whether it was to the person who had died or to us. But we used to sort of crab walk between graves and so on. And there was another rule. You were not to remove anything from the cemetery. That was definitely bad luck, and bad luck to you. So you couldn't take anything from there. Though we did move a few things around, and I suspect that the graves around my great-grandfather's grave and so on were possibly a little more decorated than otherwise they may have been. There were horseshoes and bits of purple glass and stuff that looked as if it was sort of, fairly worthless opal and that type of thing. And so we could move a few things around, but we didn't take them beyond the gate because we feared that there may be bad luck following us. Now, the cemetery in those days was not as big as it is now. You'd go in the main gate, and halfway down there was a little hut, the gravedigger's hut. And in that hut, I think he used to keep his equipment. There was a sort of a form which you would lay out to, give dimensions and so on, and then probably quite a lot of shovels. But that hut, of course, has moved now, and the janitors, I suppose, caretakers' workshop is now rather down just beside, which used to be the absolute never where the Chinese graves are. But you'd go in, and that little hut was there, and if you couldn't attend the church or whatever, you could wait in the shade under the front awning of that little hut. But the cemetery itself had a sort of a geography, and that was important because it was divided into denominational sections. Denominational is not quite the word, but nevertheless it was predominantly denominational. When you went in on the right, I think the people on the right were divided up into Church of England and probably Presbyterian, I would have thought. Presbyterians sort of got I was going to say they got the dressed circle there just inside the gate, but from the experience of the flood, maybe there was not the dressed circle after all, and the Church of England is probably a little bit better by being a little higher up, not much. On the left as you walked in, it was all in the front areas. That was the Catholic section, and it was very neat and well laid out and so on. We didn't spend a lot of time there because Wait a minute, I've got an itchy nose at the moment. The We didn't spend a lot of time there because the Roman Catholic section had a sort of style, and such inscriptions as you may find there were, we'll say, religiously inclined, whereas if you were over on the Church of England Presbyterian section, they were more inclined to give you a little bit of history there. And then beyond the Catholic section, the remaining section, that's on the northern side beyond the Catholic section, was divided into three parts. The part nearest the gully was for, I don't know whether they called it other denominations. If they did, it was not really a very good term, because this was for people who didn't fit any of the sort of Christian categories. So if you were a Jewish person or maybe a Muslim person or, whatever, you were buried in that section. And not a great number of people there, because most people fitted into the ordinary Christian denominational section. And then the second section was the Aboriginal section. It was a large section. It had about, it had 14 burials that were specifically described as being in the Aboriginal section. And then the third section was what in those days might have been sort of absolutely beyond the pale, and that must have been the Chinese section. Not that there were a great number of Chinese graves there or burials there. And so there we are. That was the general geography of the place. There was the old cemetery, of course, and maybe the old cemetery had two parts to it. Maybe there was a Protestant old cemetery and maybe there was a Catholic old cemetery. The Protestant old cemetery is on the southern side, of course, and it's easily distinguished from the more modern cemetery, because the more modern cemetery orients the graves strictly north-south, well, parallel with the gully and parallel with the fence. But in that early section, they oriented the graves roughly in a sort of a, what would that be, a northeast-southwest orientation. I don't know whether that was for some religious reason or not, why they should have oriented them like that. But if you go into the old section now, you can see quite clearly the different orientation of the graves. But the bulk of the graves in the more modern section, probably from the 1896 on, because that's the only records that I think we have, they were in the north-south orientation. But anyway, I used to spend a lot of time there, and I knew the place very well because, Monday to Friday I was at school, so I knew the school very well. And then Saturday or Sunday, well, very often we were in the cemetery because, well, what else was there to do? Nothing else. And so I always had this great interest in the cemetery because I knew it told many stories. And so some years ago, I began wondering. I used to look at the cemetery and I'd see gravestones and I'd see those metal markers and I'd see spaces and so on. And my first thought was to wonder how many people actually were taken over to that cemetery and promptly forgotten, and who were marked. Their passing was marked only by the metal grave marker, insofar as it lasted, because metal grave markers really had no great permanence in that pure sand. And so I wondered, I thought, well, how many people have got gravestones here and how many people are just forgotten? And so that took me one day to the council office, and I asked them to have a look at the cemetery records, the burial records. And so I copied them, that was in 1986, and I copied them from the first records through to the end, I think, of 1939. I didn't go any further because I had no more time. That was the first thing. And the second thing is, there are limits. But the 1939 was not a bad point to end because it was sort of the beginning of the war years. But probably in a more interesting way, it marked the last, or almost the end of the pre-penicillin period. And so those who were buried up until 1939 knew nothing of the advantages of penicillin. And so that seemed to be a reasonable point to finish at. I seem to find that I copied the records of 1,777 burials there. And so I put them on a disc and did something with them for a couple of years, and then I had to leave them for another 10 years or more before I returned to them. And so let me describe them to you. They are interesting, but they're not complete. They're complete insofar as there is a name, and they're complete insofar as there was a non-denominational section, because that was the first guide as to where the grave may be. And they would be complete also in terms of the numbering, although there were a couple of periods when whoever was in charge of the numbering may have been a bit tipsy or something, and the numbers got a little bit out of order, but that wasn't a chronic problem and wasn't a really extensive problem. But after that, well, in the early days there was very little given. They were supposed to say the name, the number, the date of the burial, the age of the person, the denominational section that they were in, the cause of their death, where they were born. There may have been other columns, I can't remember offhand, but I'll come to them if I do. And so if you'd had all 1,777 of these records with all of that information completed, then they would have been a very nice set of records to have. But of course, that didn't happen, and so the detailing of the information was haphazard, and it was quite some years before it was kept in any very systematic way. And so when I came to the records a couple of years ago and I decided to analyse all of the information that was given, I found that while I might have had a total of 1,777 records, the fact was that, I might have had a complete list of names. I had a pretty complete list of denominational sections. It didn't do too badly in terms of age. Cause of death was a bit haphazard, and that really didn't become systematic until, probably in the 20s, I would have thought. And so, it would have been lovely to find 1,777 records in which all of the information was complete. But it's not so. For instance, you might find the age of someone given, but not the cause of death, or you might find the place of birth given, but not the age, that type of thing. And there was a certain amount of guesswork too in the earlier days, and guesswork too right through until 1939, because there was no refrigeration in those days, or certainly not available in the morgue, and certainly not available to the undertaker, so that you conked out this morning and you were put down this afternoon. There was no delay. You died and you were buried with great promptness. That, of course, led to all sorts of difficulties as far as the register was concerned, because, people often had to have a guess, because the undertaker and the record keeper and the council could only rely upon such information as could be gathered immediately. And that was within horse riding or bike riding or walking distance of the undertaker, or maybe the church, or whatever it may have been. And so, there's a certain amount of guesswork there, or if it couldn't be guessed, well, it was just left vacant. But nevertheless, you put all of those difficulties aside and you do the best you can. So what I've done is I've taken the figures that are available, and in very few burials there is a complete record of all of those pieces of information for that particular person. So you just have to sort of do the best you can. So This analysis that I've done of those figures, of that information, would not make a statistician particularly happy, but nevertheless, there we are. Now let me see. I've talked about the 1,777 records and the difficulty in getting totally reliable information for all of them, and the slackness in the council office. There was one period there, I might add, that I do wonder about. They employed a clerk. Now, what did I try and think when that was? That might have been around about 1916 or something like that, or maybe in the 1930s. I can't remember. But the boy was unlettered. He obviously was a relative of someone in the council office, or if he wasn't a relative of someone in the council office, he had, as the Chinese say, strong relationships. The boy was absolutely, well, I assume it was the boy, was absolutely incompetent. He could barely write, could barely copy, and boy, you have a look at the records and they're crook, I can tell you. Okay then. Generally, they weren't too bad, but that fellow, I mean, I don't know, I have a look at it and I thought, this boy could not even have passed scholarship. You know, the transcription abilities and the writing abilities were such that, you know, I really do not know. But anyway, he's part of history now, and that's all there is to it. Okay, so what do the records tell us? And I thought that I'd indicate what the records say. Okay, then now, gender. Now, if we take the whole of the period from when I've got these records beginning in 1896 through to the end of 1939, or I suppose it was the end of 1939, but gender. Now, gender you can tell just by the name. Now, there would have been some stillborn children who didn't have the gender recorded, but the bulk of people did have gender recorded. And what that tells us is this, that it was very much a man's world. And if you take the period from 1896 through to 1939, and you say, how many men were buried, how many women were buried, 65% of the burials were of men, and only 35% of the women were female. I did have a look at the breakdown, you know, by decade, and as far as numbers are concerned, there was a strange diminution in the number of burials in the period 1900 to 1909. There were only 229 in the whole of the 10 years, whereas 1896 to 1899 there were 187. And then from 1910 through to 1939, there were generally about 440, 480 in one of the decades to make up the numbers. So they're fairly constant from 1910 through to 1939. Excuse me. I was very interested in the dearth of females in the town. I had a look at the some individual years. I took 1899, 1909, 1919 and so on. And the greatest number of females that were buried in that time was in 1909, and 35% of the burials in the year were female. The lowest number of females was in the year 1919, and there were 21. Now, they were figures that I took just of individual years in that period, but the average from those individual years accords pretty well with the overall average. And so it was very much a man's town, and so there was a great dearth of women. Now, where did they come from? Now, we know that 1,012 of the entries tell us where they were born. Now, most of the people were Australian-born residents, but there were a number from overseas. Excuse me. Of the people, of the 1,012, 9% were from England, about 6% were from Ireland, about 4% were from Scotland, and then about 4.5% were from what I call other countries. there were only 1.2% of them were non-European. And also, we know in this period, Charleville had become a place of, sort of sedentary occupation, if you like, because 35% of the burials were from Charleville-born people. When we come to religious denomination, the highest number were the Church of England, 44%, Catholic, 36%, Presbyterian, 18%, and others, 1.4%. Now, probably I would have thought that the Church of England figure was rather a little higher than was probably true in reality, because you remember the default description of any pauper or body found unidentified in the streets was Church of England. And so I dare say that quite a number of people were buried. They had no idea of their religious denomination, and they were just described as Church of England. And so I would have thought that maybe the Church of England and the Catholic figures in reality were rather more equal. Okay, so you may think it's a bit, well, women may have thought it was a good thing not to be there, but, oh yes, I see, there were 14 burials described as Aboriginal, and there were 9 Chinese. So 9 were buried in the Chinese section and 14 in the Aboriginal section. But the figure that caught my eye particularly was the infant mortality. And by infant mortality, my definition was those who didn't reach 5. And so I'm looking at stillbirths and births and deaths of young people through to age 5. But anyway, first of all, I had a look at just the longevity of those who survived beyond their 5th year. Now, there were in 1900, now I've taken a number of years here, specific years. In 1900, the longevity of people who reached over 5 years was 46.5 years. That was their average age when they died. It was much the same in 1910. The figure for 1910 was 46.3, so very little, well, 46.5, 46.3. So up until that 1910, there was no change. But then people started living longer, and by 1920, the average age of those who lived beyond 5 was 54. In 1930, it was still 54. There was a slight drop in 1939, it was 52, but that would be statistically of no consequence at all. People were living to about mid-50s beyond 1920. But when we come down to the infant mortality, those who died below 5 years, we've got some fairly ugly figures. In 1896-99, if we take the figures there were 187 burials, but 33% of them were of children below 5. 1900, 1909, 38% were below 5. 10 to 19 was 27, 1920 to 1929, 31. And by the time you get to 1930, things were a lot better because the number of burials of people below 5 was only 20%. But overall, of the 1,777, 29% of the funerals were of infants below 5. So, for instance, in 1909, if you stood on a street corner near the cemetery, 4 out of every 10 funerals that went past you were of children under 5. Now, what do they do? Most of them were bush workers, town workers and so on, labourers. But there's no record of female occupations because it was taken for granted that women wouldn't have an occupation. And so some of them were described as domestic or domestic duties, or sometimes wife or housewife, but they were never given an occupation because predominantly women didn't have occupations. There were what I call officials. Of 794 whose occupations were given, there were 5 that I would call officials, 10 that I would loosely call professionals, 27 were traders, 57 were described as pensioners. Pensioner category is interesting because there was only one woman up until 1939 who was described as a pensioner. All of the rest were males. They were generally older males, over 70, but I can't quite work out the basis upon which the pensions were granted. In 1915, there was someone aged 82 who was described as a pensioner. A fellow called in 1998, in 1920. There were some invalid pensioners along the way. There was a young fellow, 42, asthma. Another fellow in 1932 had heart problems. And an 18-year-old, an invalid pensioner, was listed in 1939. And so I don't know whether there was a Commonwealth pension. Probably in later years there was, but many of the old pensioners, had to go and live over on the sandhill. And they constructed sort of huts for themselves over bits of wood they could find, kerosene tins, sides of kerosene tins, bags. There was a communal water tap there, but there was no sewerage. There was not even a, pan service or anything. There was a tap there somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but they, didn't do well at all. The occupations that were listed are ones that we mightn't find so readily now. Let me see. I don't know the number total here, but anyway, I was looking at particular occupations. There were 155 labourers, 38 drovers, 20 cooks, 18 carriers, 8 blacksmiths, 5 fencers, 4 saddlers, 3 lengthsmen. Lengthsmen were people who worked on the line, sort of fettlers, or sometimes people who did odd jobs in pubs were called lengthsmen. 3 tank sinkers, 3 boundary riders, 2 hawkers, 2 tobacconists, 2 coach drivers, 2 scalpers and 1 trapper, 1 horse breaker, 1 professor of music, 1 general servant, 1 soap maker, 1 tonsorial artist, 1 actor and 1 cooper. They're all men. But there were a couple of women there. One was listed as a widow and another one was listed as a retired housewife. And I know that Rose Dalton was listed as a licensed victualler. And, yes, there was also an old lady described as a laundress. And she was still going as a laundress at 80. But women didn't frequently make it to the list. Okay, then. Well, now let's have a look. What killed them? Well, as I say, these percentages are not percentages of the total population of the burials. These are percentages of those for whom causes of death were actually given. Pulmonary problems, not including TB, covered 18% of the deaths. Heart problems, cardiac problems, 12.7%. Accidents, 7.3%. Cancers, 7.1%. Senile decay was listed as 6%. Gastrointestinal, 4%. Stroke, 4%. Sinister or unknown, 3%. Typhoid, only 2.7%, but that will be a figure much lower than was real, I think. And then when you come down here to typhoid, no, 2.7, I think that was higher than that. But if we, TB, now where was TB? TB was very low, that was only 2.3%. That was probably accurate. All pulmonary, I think, would have included the pneumonias, and certainly the deaths from the Spanish flu of 1919. It reached in Charleville 1919, came out on the train. And then there was another outbreak in the 1935s and so on. Okay, but the deaths recorded from the Spanish flu were very, very low and inaccurate. For instance, if you go to May 1919, there were 17 burials, and flu is listed, I think, for only one of them, I think. They show 17 burials with flu listed as good as only one. Yes, that's right. So only one. That was the worst month, and only one person is listed as dying from the Spanish flu. But we know from newspaper reports and from some recent research that there were 20 deaths in Charleville in May of 1919 from the Spanish flu. When I go to the internet to discover what I can about we'll call it the Spanish flu of 1935, I can find nothing at all. And yet there was a big outbreak of flu in 1935, and it was known as the black flu. Apparently the bodies turned black. Okay then. Gastrointestinal, well, that was largely restricted to children in their first year. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. If we look at the burials of children under 2, if your child could make it 2 over 1, they had a reasonable chance of survival. The number of burials of children between 1 and 2 was fairly small, 3% in 1900 to 1909, 2% in 1910, 1919, 3%. Okay, so through to 1929, it was around about 3% between 1 and 2. But when you get to 1930, 1939, the figure had fallen to below 1%. But the burials up to 1 year, live births this is, not stillbirths, 28% of the burials were of children, live births up to 1 year in 1900. 22%, 1910 to 1919, dropped back to 17% in 1920 and 1929, and 12% 1930 and 1939. So there's a 5% decrease in the number of children in that first year who died between 1900 and 1939. Went down by about, 6, 5, 5. About 5% each year in improvement, and that was pretty good. There are some figures available for deaths in Queensland in 1865, I think. What did I see? No, 1861. And the figures generally for Queensland in 1861 were very similar to the figures that I have got for Charleville in the period that these figures cover. However, the New England Journal of Medicine gave some figures about deaths and causes of deaths in 1900, and the Charleville figures are very similar to that, strangely enough. Pulmonary, excluding TB, 18% in Charleville, 20% in the New England Journal of Medicine. Cardiac, 12 in Charleville, 13 in 1900 in the New England Journal. Accidental deaths, much the same, and so on. Now, tuberculosis, though, if you take the figures, the New England Journal of Medicine gives the figures, causes of death in 1812. The biggest killers in 1812, first of all, at the top, was tuberculosis. 5 times the number of deaths from the number 2 cause. And the number 2 causes, we'll say, were stillbirths or childhood convulsions and influenza and pneumonia. And so, TB was a real problem then, but TB in the Charleville figures is very, very low, and that's probably because of the climate. Only 2.3% between 1896 and 1939, whereas the New England Journal of Medicine gives the figure as 19.4% for 1900, and so on. There we are. Okay then. So there we are. So on we go, and then you come to the deaths of people who would have survived if they'd had antibiotics. And so, you've got people who died from appendicitis and things like that. And I don't know whether dying in town from appendicitis would have helped, but maybe you might have been able to be operated on. But if you were some distance from the town, then your chances were not good. So there are some records that give the information about the occupation, the age, and the cause of death. And, that's a bonanza to find all 3, but what it tells us is that it was not good to be male, young, and a bush worker, because if you were a young male working in the bush, life was a bit more risky. There's a category in the burial registers listed, or that I've listed as accident. But of the people who died described as accident, there were 14 males and 3 females. The males were generally below 50, I think, if I remember rightly. And so, accident could be drowning, fractured skull, horse accident, and so on. There's a list of the drownings were generally male, tend to be younger. There were, of course, 3 females, and they were the Switzer sisters who were drowned at the, what was the name? Middle Creek, yes, Middle Creek in January of 1921. Very sad affair, that one. Fractured skulls, well, there we are. You've got kick from a horse, 2, gun accident, 1, killed by a tree, 1, staked, 1, broken neck, 1, strangulation, 1, but that was an infant. Suffocation, a male, aged 10. I don't know the story about that one. Typhoid was much more prevalent, certainly in the 19th century, than is recorded in the records, and because you can see newspaper reports of the outbreak of typhoid in Charleville. But 1911 had 1, and it kept on going 1, 3, 3, 3, 3, right through to 1938. The people who died from typhoid, mainly men, and they tended to be rural workers. And then I see there's, of course, I just make a point over here in terms of hygiene and so on. Hygiene in the country was probably not able to be as well maintained by bushworkers as by town workers. And the town did have access to some ice at some stage. George Harriman had ice works in Watson Street behind the garage there. And he used to deliver ice up until the outbreak of World War II. But then, of course, with petrol rationing, you had to go and get your own ice. Sinister deaths, there could be murder, poisoning, suicides, and so on. So let me see. There were deaths included, there was a fair range here. Arsenic poisoning, 1, bullets, 7, cutthroats, 2, lightning, 2, other poisons, 2, cyanide, 1, strychnine, 1, strangulation, 1, suicide, 8, found dead at the ward, 1, lost in bush, and so on and so on. And so, there we are, that's it. Not the figures there, but if you want them, well then somehow or another you've got to get access to that particular essay in Volume 8. But I'll see if I can make that available to Historic House or something like that. But all in all, it was it was a period without antibiotics. It was risky to be in the country and risky to be male because so many of the occupations were by their very nature risky. There was a lot of drinking going on and a lot of depression, I would have thought, and so you have these strychnines, arsenic, cyanide, the whole range of it all. But the sad thing about it all, of course, is the rate of infant mortality. And so I think people who raised their child to 1 would certainly have rejoiced. And if you get your child to 2, then you weren't doing too badly at all. But I'm surprised at the number of stillbirths there. I don't know. I mean, I'm no gynecologist or whatever the specialty may be, but I mean, why would there be so many stillbirths? Is it a matter of, difficult pregnancies, or is it a matter of maternal lack of nutrition? Perhaps the nutrition level was not good. Or if there was, a problem with convulsions or whatever it may have been and fevers, there was no ready access to medicine. And I think people in those days were rather more reluctant to rush off to the doctor than we are today because, I know within our own household I don't know. There was no question of going to the doctor. You probably went over to Bullwater Barnes and got what you could. But the idea of going to the doctor, you had to be almost in extremis to go to the doctor, I would have thought. And So you probably got by as best you could. My mother tells me that when I was young, 2 perhaps, I had trachoma now. As you well know, trachoma was a terrible problem in the West in those days, what with the flies and whatever else caused it. But I had trachoma, but that, excuse me, that never occasioned a visit to the doctor, for God's sake. But my mother says, I think I quote her correctly, that the old wives' story about you treat trachoma with prussic acid. Well, I don't know what prussic acid is, and I don't know how you apply prussic acid, but if you were a mother, you didn't go and see Dr. Fox or whoever it may have been. You got the prussic acid. And, well, anyway, here I am. I'm still seeing, but a lot of people, a lot of kids out there were very badly affected, particularly the Aboriginal population was very badly affected by trachoma. So, I mean, we're lucky. We're living today and we're not doing too badly. But it was rather more of a risk if you'd been around in the earlier times. I've got one more thing here. They did go, the boar turned up in what? I can't remember the figure offhand, probably about 1889, I think, a bit after the train arrived. But it was some time before they actually began using the water from for household use. And in any case, for a lot of people in the town, the water was boiling. And you couldn't really drink it, and it had a pretty horrible taste. It made teas that were sort of jet black and fairly horrible. We had bore water at the school in the early 40s, but it was so damn hot you couldn't drink it. And there were a couple of rainwater tanks there that water had a sort of an acrid taste, which was reputed to be the piss of frogs, which may or not be so. And so this year I've got here 1901. People were still, a lot of people were still getting their water from wells. And I assume that street called Wells Street had one or more wells in it. In the 20s, I know when I listened to my aunt, she used to tell me that you'd get the billy goat cart and you'd go down to the river to get water. And I take it you'd boil it when you get home. So not everyone got their water from the wells. They'd get it from, the 2 Mile probably, I would have thought. That was still in the 20s. And I also know that Gordons, who lived next door to us, were in trouble with the council in the 30s because they still had, pit toilets down the back. So that wasn't, and old Sarah didn't mind a few flies around too, and she used to make brownies, and the brownies used to have flies crawling over them, but Sarah must have had trachoma because she couldn't see very well, so she certainly didn't see the flies. But by the time I was born, we had the pan service. The pan service had been around for quite a while, and the sewage service came in the early 40s, I think about 1943. And certainly by the time I started school, there was the boys' toilets and girls' toilets were flush toilets. Householders, after about 1943, began getting the flush toilets. But before then, there was the pan service with the thunderboxes down the backyard, and Jack Jeffries was known as the Gidgee Night Man, and he would come in once a week and collect them. But there were a lot of people who apparently in the centre of town used to get their water from the wells. And there was some question about the quality of water from the wells, and so the town clerk sent some samples of the 4 wells off to the Bacteriological Institute in Brisbane. And the result of the examination of the water from the wells was a very sad one. There was Heinemann's well, there was Carroll's well, there was Williams's well, and there was Matthew's well. And, oh dear, the bacterial count in each of them was fairly terrible. Williams's well was particularly terrible, and all of them were infected with or contaminated with fecal matter. And one of them, actually Williams's, had typhoid germs in it. And he declared that the water in each of the 4 wells was unfit for human consumption, but it was being consumed in 1901. It may have been that after that they hurried up the business of the reticulation of water through the town. And once people actually got this water, I'm sure that it had an impact upon the general health well-being of people in the town. So anyway, there we are. But that, of course, takes me a little away from the cemetery, but nevertheless. But the cemetery is an absolute treasury of information about the town, the people, the work, where they came from. If you want a picture of the town, well, you can, if you want, sort through the trove of files, and that's hard work. Go down to the cemetery and have a look. But I will try to get a copy of this analysis of the information in the cemetery records out to Historic House. And if it's something that you're really interested in, we'll go and have a look at it there. I can give you the information in the raw state. Now, when I say I've got copies of the cemetery records to 1939, I mean, that's true. However, what I did then was I matched those records with the information from the Department of Justice births, deaths and marriages records, and then I matched them again with the Australian Cemeteries Index, and then I matched them again, I mentioned that one, the Department of Justice. So what I've got in my listing is the information in the burial records matched with what's in the Cemetery Records Index, matched also with the information from the Department of Justice, because there are many contradictions there, and I've tried to resolve those contradictions. But anyway, at some stage I'll get that information out there, and you can go to that particular record that I've got of the raw data, and then you can begin counting for yourself if you like. Or you can have a look at this rough analysis, because that may give you a sufficient picture to satisfy your interest. So there we are.